welcome back to another episode of Bright Brains. Today, I'm diving deep into one of the most enduring mysteries in American history, the case of D.B. Cooper. My guest is Darren Schaefer, a leading expert on the subject and the host of the Cooper Vortex podcast, where he explores the countless theories and details surrounding this incredible case. Darren, thank you for joining me today. I can't wait to unpack this mystery with you. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on, Isaac. I appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. So tell us a little bit about yourself and how you became so fascinated with this case.
So I grew up in Woodland, Washington, which would be like the closest city to where DB Cooper is believed to have jumped. So it was always just sort of a local story. I was kind of interested in it. It was just a cool, fun story. But then a couple of things happened all around the same time. My wife got me this book, Skyjack by Jeffrey Gray, about the DB Cooper case. And I read that traveling and was just blown away by how much I didn't know. And there's so much more to the story than what I thought. And so that led me to another book. And then at the same time, I started this job where I work completely alone. So for 40 to 60 hours a week, I had talk radio and podcasts playing in my ear. And at that point, I really fell into the Cooper Vortex, as they call it. I didn't coin that term. It was already out there. They said they call it the Cooper Vortex because once you get sucked in, you can't escape. So at that point, I'm desperate for podcasts to listen to. So this is like 2014, 2015. So I just typed DB Cooper in the search bar on Apple Podcasts. And there were at that point in time, there were probably about 20 shows that had done an episode on DB Cooper. So I was like, okay, I'm going to hammer through all these podcast episodes and see what it's all about. And they were all exactly the same. It was two or three hosts. They would basically read the Wikipedia page on the skyjacking, then they would discuss two or three suspects. And then in the final 5 minutes of the show, they would decide who was most likely, and case closed, they solved the DB Cooper case. But I was so much deeper in this by this point than that. It was just surface level stuff for me. I really wanted to hear long form interviews with the people that were writing books on this case, with the people that were arguing all day long online about this. I wanted to hear long form interviews with the FBI agents that worked on this case. And so I just decided, you know what? I'm just going to create the show that I want to listen to. So I reached out to five different people and I told myself, okay, if two of these five people say yes to be on my show that doesn't exist yet, then I'll actually create it. So I reached out to five people and all five people were like, yeah, I'd love to be on that show. So at that point, I started my podcast and thought I'd be doing it for a few months and it'd be a fun project to work on and I'd learn a few things. But here I am 6 years later, still doing it.
Oh, wow. So 6 years worth of content. I honestly would have never thought you could like get that much content out of this case. So it must really be a vortex of information out there. So for the people who aren't familiar with this case, let's give like a brief overview of basically what it is, what happened.
Yeah, no problem. November 24th, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving, a middle-aged man in a business suit walks up to the ticket counter at the Portland International Airport. He buys a one-way ticket to Seattle. With tax, it's $20. He pays for the ticket in cash. At that point in time, the only identification you needed to fly was the gate agent asked him his name. And he
That's wild.
responds, Cooper, Dan Cooper. And then the gate agent writes Dan Cooper on the ticket, and he's good to go. He's one of the last to board the plane. It's going to take off at 2:50 from Portland. Right as the plane's taking off, he hands a stewardess a note. She hilariously assumes that it's just another businessman hitting on her, so she puts the note in her purse without looking at it. He notices this and says, "Excuse me, miss, you might want to have a look at that note. I have a bomb." He's now hijacking the plane. He has a bomb in his briefcase. He wants $200,000 and two sets of parachutes, two mains and two reserves, or two backs and two fronts, ready before they land in Seattle. They agree to his demands. They have everything ready for him. The plane lands around 5:50 in Seattle. He lets the passengers off once he gets his $200,000 and four parachutes. Interestingly, the passengers did not know the plane was being hijacked. So he was able to control the situation the whole time. They thought it was a mechanical delay, so they had to circle the airport. So the first time the passengers realized they were being hijacked was when they got off the plane and the FBI was waiting there. Okay, so now Cooper wants to take off to Mexico City, but more important than where he wants to go, he tells the pilots how to fly the plane. He wants the plane to fly at 10,000 feet. He wants the landing gear down. The plane will remain unpressurized. The flaps will be set to 15 degrees, and he wants the plane to go no faster than 200 miles an hour. So, and then also importantly, he wants the plane to take off with the aft stairs down. And the pilots aren't even sure if the plane can fly with the aft stairs down, nevertheless take off. So they call into air traffic control, hey, can this 727 fly with the aft stairs down? They're looking at manuals, they have no idea. So they call Boeing and say, hey, can this 727 fly with the aft stairs down? And Boeing says, yes, we've tested that, and that plane can fly with the aft stairs down. So with the flight configuration that Cooper asked for, the plane doesn't have enough fuel to make it to Mexico City. They discuss a couple refueling stops and agree to a refueling stop in Reno. However, the pilots refuse to take off with the aft stairs down. They said it's not safe in a plane full of fuel. It could be throwing sparks everywhere, could do damage. They refuse to do that. Interestingly, Cooper tells them that he disagrees with their assessment about it being unsafe, but tells them he can lower the stairs in the air. So the plane takes off from Seattle around 7:45 for Reno, Nevada. In the flight configuration Cooper asked for, he asked for one stewardess to remain to be the go-between between him and the pilots. At a certain point, she shows him how to lower the aft stairs, and then he tells her to go into the cockpit. The last thing she sees is him putting his parachute on. She comments that it looked like he had done that many times before. She goes into the cockpit. The plane lands in Reno, and Cooper is not on board.
Jumped off of the plane. Whereabout did he jump?
Well, that's a good question. When they land in Reno, they really don't know. So they had to figure out about when and where did Cooper jump.
So
And
they didn't
during
know hold on, I didn't mean to cut you off. They didn't know he had jumped.
They knew he jumped, but they didn't know where. They just knew it was somewhere between Seattle and Reno, which is a long ways because nobody
Yeah.
actually saw him jump from the plane.
All right. So
So
how did that happen? How did they not see him jump?
because it's nighttime, you have cloud cover and it's a little bit overcast, a little rainy. So they scrambled these two jets to fly and follow the plane. But Cooper chose a speed that was just sort of below the stall speed of those jets. So they had to make these wide S turns to burn off some speed. So even if they were close enough that they could potentially see a man jump from the plane, the conditions just weren't such that they'd be able to see that. So, but the pilots did experience what they called a pressure bump in the plane around 8:12 p.m. And so they theorized that that pressure bump could be from him standing on the aft stairs. And then when he jumps from those stairs, they recoil, bounce up, and you have this sort of air pressure that's pushed back into the plane. And so to test that theory, they took the exact same plane, not the same make and model, that exact same plane that Cooper hijacked. They flew it out over the Pacific Ocean, and then they pushed a 200-pound sled off the back of the stairs to see if it would recreate that pressure bump they experienced. And they believed that it did. So they used that 8:12 marker as a point which they believe Cooper jumped from the plane.
I'm Ike.
And I'm Vera, and we're the hosts of the new podcast, Odd Brains, premiering September 1st on Patreon.
Join us now for early access to exclusive content that will otherwise not be available until our official YouTube launch later this year.
Decriminalized is the first installment of the Odd Brains series. Join us as we chat with an EMS from Portland and San Francisco, Colton Perry of the podcast Just Dumb Enough.
Okay. Check it out on Patreon. dropping September 1st, and stay tuned for further updates about additional episodes and other projects to come. You can support the Vagabond Initiative by joining our Patreon and spreading the word. Also, check out www.badproduct.co with coupon code VAGABARD. That's VAGABARD for 10% off. We appreciate any engagement whatsoever, and all proceeds will be used to reinvest into the brand.
The link is in the bio below.
Gotcha. And that A12 marker, where about was that?
It would
You said it
be
was in
sort of
Seattle?
just south of Ariel Amboy, just north of Vancouver, Washington.
Gotcha. So he jumped over civilization. It wasn't like over the ocean or anything like that.
No, and that's sort of a misconception. If you watched the movie Without a Paddle, they sort of stumble across DB Cooper's body and he had burned the money to stay alive. It's civilization. It's not like the most wooded remote area. There are roads, there are businesses, there are homes, there's railroad tracks.
That's interesting. So the stewardess didn't see him jump off the plane? Like
No,
she
so when
didn't.
he was getting ready to jump, he instructed her to go into the cockpit with the rest of the flight crew.
All right, then. Gotcha. So I was wondering, I just assumed that the stewardess would see him jump off and maybe look at a window or something and see, oh, we're right above this city or something like that. So this thing seems very meticulously planned. Like
It
it was,
certainly does.
yeah, it seems like something out of a movie, honestly. So what do we know about DB Cooper?
That's what we know about it. That's the interesting thing about this is he only exists for 5 hours. He gets on the plane about 2:50 and then jumps out of it at 8:12, 8:13. There is no story before that. There is no story after that. This whole thing, I mean, I've done hundreds of hours on my show about this, even though it took place in a period of 5 hours. But I mean, what we do know is Tina Mucklow, she sat next to him most of that time. And she describes him as being super average. So he's mid to late 40s, he's average height, he's average build, he doesn't have any discernible accent, he doesn't have any distinguishing marks or scars or tattoos. He's extraordinarily ordinary.
So right after this happened, how did the FBI and police respond?
Well, the FBI didn't think he was going to jump from the plane. So when the plane lands in Reno, they expected him to still be on board. They were ready with teams when they landed in Reno. So they land in Reno. One of the flight crew goes back to check if he's still back there. He's not back there. And so the plane is then immediately searched with dogs. There is sort of this weird theory people develop that Cooper either never existed or he hid on the plane. Both of those are completely ridiculous. But this is a novel crime for the FBI. So skyjacking was not rare in the late 60s and early 70s, but the vast majority of those skyjackings were politically motivated, hey, take me to Cuba, kind of a thing. And nobody had held out a plane for ransom and then jumped out of one. So they had to go about figuring out who this was when it was a completely new type of crime. So they didn't even know exactly where he jumped out of the plane until about 40 hours later. So he had quite a head start. And then the weather in the search area was not ideal. It would have You would have got some snow a couple of weeks later and rain and miserable weather to be stomping through the woods. So they didn't even really search his proposed drop zone on foot until months later. The next day, or when the sun comes up, you had a couple of FBI agents in their own personal planes flying over the proposed flight to see if they could find a parachute or any evidence of where he jumped. They actually flew the SR-71 Blackbird over the entire flight path twice to photograph it to see if they could find anything. And they had to do it twice because the first time there was bad weather, shocker, in the Pacific Northwest, and the photos were no good, so they had to do it a second time.
You said there was a lot of skyjackings during this period in the 70s. What were some other notable skyjackings? And obviously, we don't really have too many of these lately. I'm assuming that this DB Cooper case may have like caused a lot of changes in the industry. What were those changes?
Uh, I would say yes and no to that. So at the time, there was already this debate on who is responsible for security at airports. The
Mm.
airports were saying that the airlines should take responsibility for security. The airlines were saying it's the government's responsibility for security, and the government was saying the airport should be responsible for security. So everyone knew that something needed to be done, but nobody wanted to be the one to do it. Cooper did spawn a handful of copycats, but the one security change that you can point directly to DB Cooper is what's called the Cooper vane. And what that is it's a switch on 727s with those aft stairs. So when the plane is in motion, there's enough wind that pushes this flap to be in line with the plane, and that locks the aft stairs. So those aft stairs can only be opened and closed when the plane is stopped and not in motion.
What is your theory, like your personal theory about who DB Cooper was and how he managed to get away with it? Or what do you think is the best, most plausible theory? I guess I should ask.
See, I'm not sure. I've been in this so long that it's changed so many times. I think there is sort of a profile I would lean towards, and that's more of I think he's some sort of a military badass because of his age, for one. So if I told you, hey, there was this crazy skyjacking and the guy jumped out, right away, you'd probably be thinking, okay, that's a young guy's crime. This guy is 24, 25, not 46 or 47, however old Cooper was. So I think that's interesting, as well as the fact that he was calm, cool, and collected the entire time. And I think that speaks to someone who has pulled dangerous operations and complex things before, where he's able to do this and be calm, cool, and collected. Immediately after the skyjacking, they interview Tina Mucklow, and she says that I'm paraphrasing, but it's dang near the exact quote, that he was kind and polite and that he was never cruel or unfriendly. He got annoyed at a certain point, but was never cross with her. And
Yeah,
he would just threatened her life. And she describes him as being kind and polite.
yeah. During my research of this, in anticipation of this interview, he seemed kind of like a James Bond almost. Even
Absolutely.
like even like the sketch kind of looks a little bit like Daniel Craig. And
Yes.
here's my theory. And well, actually, let me wait until I tell my theory. So you said you've had your theory, but it's changed so many times over the years. So what are some developments that keep popping up in this case that have caused you to change your theory over the time?
Well, some of it is just the fact that I've discussed things ad nauseum. Others, we really don't have a lot of physical evidence in this case. So when he jumped off the plane, he took his briefcase bomb with him. The notes that he passed to the stewardess, he asked for his notes back. To the James Bond aspect of this, the stewardess that sat next to him, she actually lit his cigarettes for him, which I just find so interesting. But at a certain point, she uses the last match in his matchbook to light his cigarette. He asked for the matchbook back. So when he jumps off that plane, the only thing he leaves behind is he leaves behind a black clip-on tie. And that tie is really some of the only evidence we have as to who Cooper might be. And unfortunately, it's more puzzling than it answers any questions for us. So, because of some forensic work done on the tie by a civilian, Tom Kay, which is most of the forensic work in this case has been done by civilians, he's discovered a bunch of super exotic metals and rare earth materials and just a really weird subset and combination of elements on this tie. If you and I wore a tie all day, every day, we would never have this combination of elements and materials on the tie. And so it's sort of pointed us as maybe Cooper could be involved in some sort of metallurgy or metal fabrication, which isn't exactly the field we would think he would come from, but that's pointed us in that direction. The other piece of evidence that we have in this case is Cooper got $200,000 in $20 bills, and that we have all of those serial numbers. The bills weren't marked, they were perfectly good 20s, but we have all of the serial numbers logged. And the only money that was recovered was found in 1980 on the shore of the Columbia River. An 8-year-old boy is out with his dad. He brushes some sand aside to make a fire and then stumbles across some garbage. His dad picks it up, looks at it for a second, and it's this brick of really badly deteriorated money. And it turns out that that was Cooper's. Now, that you would think that would lead us in some avenue, some direction. Here's somewhere we could go. This is maybe where he landed. None of that works, unfortunately. It's about 15 miles west of where the plane would have been. If Cooper jumps, the wind would have taken him east. It just really doesn't answer any questions. It only adds more mystery. On the show, I've asked people what they think of that Tina Barr money find. And people who have spent hundreds of hours investigating this have told me they wished that it never happened because it only adds more mystery. It doesn't answer any questions. We've even discussed, like, would DB Cooper himself know how that money got there?
Yeah. I wonder if maybe he like when he jumped off the plane, he might have took a brick of money and threw it in the opposite direction he was going as sort of like a red herring, you know, to throw
Well, we could
people.
definitely go down that route because when Tina Mucklow brings the money aboard the plane, he
Hmm.
gets sort of excited looking at it. And she comments, wow, that's a lot of money. And he reaches into the bag and offers her $6,000. And she makes a joke and says, I'm sorry, we can't accept gratuity. And then $6,000 is found on Tina Barr. Is that an homage? Is that some sort of a love letter?
Tina Barr. Who is Tina Barr?
Tina Barr is where the money was found.
Oh, hmm. That is interesting. All right, then. So I want to go back to this tie. What are some theories as to why he would have all these metals, these strange metals on his tie? Has anybody ever tried to answer that?
Oh, yes. I recently had Stan Siegel on my show, who's
Hmm.
90 years old and just like as brilliant as can be. And he got his start in the titanium industry in the late 1950s and knows everything about it because there are these super rare titanium particles on the tie. And in 1971, there weren't a lot of industry using that specific type of titanium. And so I asked him, because he took a look at the tie particles on there, and I was like, what does this say to you? Like, what industry do you think this tie came from? Who would be wearing this tie, be exposed to all this? And even he was like, I don't know. It's a really weird combination on that tie. It does seem to point more towards some sort of a fabrication or metallurgy just based on the particles on the tie, but it's weird because you have all these suspects. So I could be out there and like I'm pushing Kenny Christensen. Kenny Christensen is my DB Cooper suspect. Well, now we look at these tie particles and it's like, well, how can you explain that combination of particles on Kenny Christensen's tie? They just wouldn't make any sense. So it's another thing in this case where it just sort of throws a monkey wrench into what we thought.
That's interesting. So, who are some of the common suspects that people have maybe attributed this hijacking to? Are there like anybody who people say, "Oh, it's this guy" or "It's that guy"? Who are
Oh
some
yeah,
of the common?
there's a
Yeah.
million suspects, truly a million of them, because Cooper is sort of everyone. There's two different sketches, so you could match your suspect to whichever sketch you like. Everything about Cooper is average. I made a joke on my show, like if you pulled up a picture of your grandfather, it will match the DB Cooper sketch. And I got an email from someone. They're like, yeah, I know for a fact my grandpa wasn't DB Cooper, but look at this picture of him. It exactly matches the sketch. And it's just so true. So a lot of people can be made a suspect, but I think more interesting than how many suspects there are in this case is the number of confessions. So it's not like we have one deathbed confession in this where he told someone, a relative, a friend, I'm DB Cooper. We have dozens of deathbed confessions. And depending on the account, there could be as many as 1,000 people that have seriously confessed to this crime. In a non-serious way, you can just go on Twitter and type I am DB Cooper in your search bar, and there will be 10,000 people on Twitter that have broadcast that. And that's not very serious, but I did talk to Larry Carr, who is the lead case agent on the DB Cooper case, or the Norjack case, in the late 2000s, 2006-ish to 2014, something like that. And I asked him about the confessions, and he said when he was the lead case agent, several people went into FBI offices to confess to this crime, which just totally blows my mind because if it's me and you at the bar, Isaac, and I'm like, hey man, you know that DB Cooper thing? That was totally me. I did that. I'm such a badass, right? I get that. I get that confession. I don't get the part where you go into an FBI office and confess to a crime you know you did not commit. That's just
Yeah.
insane.
Yeah, it is insane. I think there are people out there who just they want to be known for something. They want to accomplish something. And so, DB Cooper, that's one of the most interesting unsolved American cases out there. So I think it's people just want to be a part of something. There's been other interesting like copycats of other cases where people try to say that there's somebody who did this, or like people will claim to be a missing child all grown up or something. So I'm not surprised about people pretending to be DB Cooper. But let's get into some of the theories about what happened or who this guy was. What are some of your favorite theories?
Well, that just depends exactly on who your suspect is.
Yeah.
I've always said if I got to pick who DB Cooper was, this isn't who I think it's most likely, but
Hmm.
another person that confessed to the crime is Barb Dayton. Born
Hmm.
Robert Dayton, she was the first person in Washington state to have gender reassignment surgery in 1969, 2 years before the hijacking. So she's working as a librarian at the Seattle Public Library, sort of falls into this depression. Things aren't going exactly how she thought they'd be post transition. So she wants to prove to herself that she's still this badass dude who could do anything, who's merchant marine and a biker. And so she does this skyjacking just to prove that she's still a badass and basically just ditches the money because it wasn't about that. It was about just proving to herself that she's still a badass. And then she confesses to being DB Cooper to Ron and Pat Foreman years later. But it's just a very, very interesting story. And Barb Dayton is just a total badass. There's a great book on Barb, DB Cooper, or The Legend of DB Cooper, Death by Natural Causes by Ron and Pat Foreman. I highly recommend it.
All right, I'll definitely check it out. So you said you don't think that was the most likely person. Who do you think is the most likely?
Well, that changes from time to time because I'm a gullible fool. But there are a couple really interesting suspects right now. I would say Milton Vordal, who was a metallurgist,
Hmm.
a very interesting character, an absolute narcissist. Ted Braden, he's another guy. He's a super military badass. Was on this Mac v Thog team. He went AWOL in Vietnam. Is caught in the Congo working as a mercenary for hire. Brought back to the States, put it at Fort Dix, I believe. And I spoke to one of the guys who was running that that military prison and said when he walked by Ted Braden's cell, he was in there in full uniform with a belt and polished shoes. He was smoking a wood-tipped cigar and watching television. And he told me, Darren, none of those things I just mentioned were allowed. So I knew right away that this guy was above my pay grade. And when it came time for his trial, going AWOL and then working as a mercenary, you could be facing the rest of your life in military prison. When the day of his trial came, he was released and it said there wasn't enough staff for a trial that day. And then he just walked out. Good friends with Jack Singlob of the CIA. He's just a very mysterious figure, a total badass, and someone who could have easily planned and executed this. The last suspect I think is really interesting these days is Lauren Skip Hall, which if you're real deep in the JFK assassination, it's a name you'll recognize because he's, if not directly involved in that, peripherally involved in the JFK assassination as well. And an interesting suspect, DB Cooper is described as having olive or swarthy skin. And if you looked at a board with all of the suspects, it's a bunch of really pasty white faces. And Lauren Skip Hall actually used an alias as Lorenzo Passia for a while. And, just based on looking at me, you could tell Isaac that I wouldn't be able to go by that alias. It just wouldn't work for me, but it was able to work for him. So there are many other reasons why Lauren Skip Hall is interesting, but he's also one of the only ones where he has the complexion that Cooper does as well.
That's interesting. So here's my theory about what happened, right? So around this time period, right? Now, keep in mind, I don't know as much about this case. So when I give you this theory, feel free to shoot holes in it or whatever. But around this time period, skyjackings were a lot more common, right? And as you said, there was a lot of debate about who was responsible for security, right? The airport, the airlines, or the government. So I think that the government planned this skyjacking as a way to finally get, to move the needle, so to speak, and get something done because, skyjackings can be dangerous. 9/11, for example, right? So they see that this is a security risk, so they need something to be done. DB Cooper, everything I read about it, he's clearly some sort of military man, some kind of like smooth operator, some kind of secret agent. So the government, they planned this and they planned it down to a T. He knew a lot about how planes work from the whole configuration that he wanted the plane to fly. He knew about the weather. He knew how to jump out of a plane. And they did this because they wanted some big case to finally cause change in the aeronautical industry. He's not meant to be found, and he never will be. So that's my take on it. I think the government was behind all this. So what do you think about that?
I can give you a ton of fuel for that conspiracy fire.
All
So,
right.
November 24th, 1971, that's the date of the DB Cooper hijacking. There's a gentleman, Najib Halaby, who was the head of the FAA, and then he was like CEO of Pan Am and or United, uh, a huge bigwig in the airline industry. He was actually meeting with Nixon that day. So at
Mm.
like noon on November 24th, 1971, East Coast time, Najib Halaby is meeting with Nixon about airline security. Quite the coincidence. Also, if you want to keep going down that, you have E. Howard Hunt, who is been proposed as a DB Cooper suspect. So he is one of Nixon's plumbers. Nixon's meeting with the head of the FAA in Pan Am that day. And then you have E. Howard Hunt, who's on the Watergate trials with sunglasses on, just like DB Cooper was on the plane with sunglasses. Hunt would have been able to plan something like this. He likely would have been able to execute something like this. He was around the right age to be a suspect. He fits the physical description. He has friends in high places who could protect him. Did he do this as an operation, or did he do this sort of on his own because he always saw himself as this James Bond daredevil spy and knew that if he pulled it off and got caught, he could be like, well, I did it for this change in security, knowing that someone would have his back.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that might be it, man. That's my guess. Has there any has there been anybody who has been arrested and interrogated by the FBI? Like, has there been any times where the FBI was like, "Oh, we got him this time," but then they end up having to let somebody go or something?
Well, there are two different suspects that the FBI arrested for other crimes that they then
Hmm.
asked them about DB Cooper. And those two people are Richard McCoy and Robert Rackstraw. So Richard McCoy pulled off a copycat hijacking that was very similar to Cooper's. And not only was it similar, it's like he improved on a couple of things that Cooper messed up. So, because this isn't the FBI's first rodeo with skyjacking, McCoy asks for two parachutes. They put tracking devices in those parachutes. McCoy brought his own parachute on the plane. So he threw those parachutes out the back of the plane with the tracking devices in them. So the FBI went looking for those parachutes and not him. McCoy also gave more specific flight instructions. McCoy was able to jump within like 2 or 3 miles of his house. But McCoy was very sloppy in his execution. He drew attention to himself. He was definitely not calm, cool, and collected. And he ran his mouth about it. I mean, the reason he got caught is he was discussing hijacking planes with his buddies. Like, I could do that. That'd be easy. And so when this happens in his neighborhood, of course they're going to be like, well, I did talk to Richard McCoy about it. And so McCoy's caught, he's arrested. They ask him about the DB Cooper thing. They look at his history. They rule him out as being a potential suspect in the DB Cooper case. The other one is Robert Rackstraw. Robert Rackstraw is arrested for the murder of his stepfather. And while he's in custody, they ask him about the DB Cooper thing. And he is super coy about it. He's like, well, maybe it's me, maybe it's not. You can actually watch a video of that on YouTube where he's talking to a reporter. Maybe I'm DB Cooper, maybe I'm not. If they let this go, and maybe I'll tell him about it. He's not DB Cooper. It doesn't make sense. And the FBI ruled him out as a suspect as well. But that is two instances where if you're going to push them as a suspect these days, it just seems kind of ridiculous when the FBI had that person in custody. And if there was anything that they could link that person to the DB Cooper skyjacking, they would have done it.
Is the FBI still actively investigating this case?
They are not. So they suspended the case in 2016. And that doesn't mean they aren't looking at it anymore. It just means they aren't spending resources. There aren't agents assigned to this case. If Isaac finds a briefcase bomb next to a skeleton and a $200,000, then yeah, the FBI would be interested in hearing about that so they can close the case, but they're not actively pursuing it.
Hmm. That's wild. So earlier you mentioned that a lot of the investigators on this case are civilians. Is that because the FBI has stopped investigating it?
Exactly. And so as part of this lawsuit brought by Mark Zaid, I believe, the all the DB Cooper FBI files have been released or are being released, and over the course of like a 10-year period, it's something ridiculous because there's a trillion files on this. But now we can sort of go through those and look at what avenues the FBI went down and what leads they had and what they chased and what they thought about it. And it's really interesting to read because right away they have no leads. So they're going off, okay, anyone that's a licensed parachutist is now a suspect because the skydiving community was much, much smaller in 1971. So they basically went through every licensed parachutist to see if they were a suspect or not. One of the only passengers that got a good look at Cooper was a real young guy named Bill Mitchell who was flying back home from college and he looked over to see the hot young stewardess lighting this old guy's cigarettes, and he thought to himself, why is that geeky old guy getting all of that girl's attention and not me? Like, I'm sitting right here. Like, why him? And so that's really one of the only eyewitness descriptions aside from the stewardess where he got a good look at him.
What about during this time, did airplanes have black boxes and things like that installed on them? You know,
Yes.
when yeah. So when they checked the black box of this airplane, did they like find anything there that could help them lead them to DB Cooper or anything like that? Or
Well, they knew the plane was being hijacked, so there were a bunch of people that were logging all of the radio recordings, as well as the Air Force was using the Sage radar system to track the location of the plane as well. So we have the log of all the communications. Cooper was never on that. He made all of his communications to the stewardess, who then relayed it to the flight crew, who then radioed it in to the air traffic control, and then another person was logging that. So all of the communications is just basically this horrible game of telephone. So we can't even be 100% sure on a direct quote from Cooper. We have things like I said, he said to the stewardess, Miss, you better have a look at that note. I have a bomb. I mean, in my opinion, that's pretty close to a direct quote, but that's what Cooper said to Florence Schaffner, who then told Radizak, who then radioed that in. So is it a direct quote? I'm not 100% sure.
Hey, sorry to interrupt, but are you looking to reach a dynamic and engaged audience of curious minds? Well, look no further. Bright Brains Podcast is the perfect platform to showcase your business or product. You'll be able to reach a diverse and intelligent audience and engage with listeners passionate about personal development, technology, and more. Elevate your brand through thought-provoking discussions. Don't miss this opportunity to promote your business on one of the fastest growing podcasts in the market. Contact us today to discuss advertising options and elevate your brand to the next level. Contact us at brightbrainspod@gmail.com to secure your advertising spot on Bright Brains today. Again, that's Bright Brains with a Z pod pod @gmail.com. Now, back to the podcast.
that's interesting. So, what are some other things that civilian investigators have found about this case that you find to be interesting?
Well, one thing that's happened recently is there's a very mysterious book from 1985 called DB Cooper, What Really Happened by Max Gunther. And Max Gunther is this serious journalist. He releases this book as nonfiction. And at the beginning of the book, he says, I'm releasing this book as nonfiction. I believe it to be true, but as a journalist, I can't prove it. This is a story that I've been told. And again, I believe it to be true, but I can't prove it. And the story is basically DB Cooper's widow writing to this guy to tell him the story of DB Cooper. And that book sort of got poo-pooed and that's not true. And we've got this story in there and we know that's not accurate and this part doesn't make sense. But then there were a couple things in there that became really interesting once the FBI files were out. Two things in particular was there's this story of what's called the Elsinore Ghost, which is a few weeks before the hijacking. This guy, Lyle Cameron, who runs this drop zone in Lake Elsinore, California, describes a guy who fits the description of DB Cooper coming in asking about parachuting from a jet. And they described him as wearing Cochrane boots, which is like an Air Force jump boot. And so they didn't really think anything about it until hearing about this DB Cooper crime. And it's like, whoa, there was that guy that came in a few weeks ago. And we didn't know that story. That story is in Max Gunther's book, but we didn't believe it. The FBI files come out, and boom, in the FBI files is this story from Lyle Cameron about this Elsinore ghost. The other interesting thing in there is they described Cooper as working in industrial chemicals, sales of industrial chemicals. Okay, cool, whatever. But once we did the particle analysis on the tie, you have all these weird particles with pure titanium. What would be using pure titanium in 1970? Oh, they would be using it to store some crazy chemicals, acids, and things in titanium tanks. So there is a reasonable avenue for the tie particles in this Max Gunther book. Now, the interesting new development that I'm getting to, I had to give you all that backstory first. So it's D.B. Cooper's widow that is writing to Max Gunther about this book. Well, Barb Dayton, the transgender suspect in this case, we have some writings from her that she wrote to her kids and letters she wrote to the Foremans in the Foreman's book. And so this researcher, Martin Andrade, who's just this brilliant guy, he used what's called stylometry, which is a writing analysis and word choice analysis. So he put Barb Dayton's letters into this program to compare them to Clara's letters, D.B. Cooper's widow, in Max Gunther, what really happened, and found it to be like a 99% match. So is Clara in Max Gunther's book Barb Dayton, which you have this suspect who does have some gender dysphoria going on there. Is she D.B. Cooper and Clara? Or was she just obsessed with D.B. Cooper, which we know she was, and made up this story about Clara and sent it to Max Gunther? So she is, even in the made-up story, she is both Cooper and Clara, because in real life, she's Cooper and Clara.
So let me make sure I understand this theory correctly. So the name of the transgender woman, what was her name?
Barb Dayton.
Barb Dayton. So you're saying that Barb was previously, or a transgender, so male to female,
Correct.
and she hijacked this plane as a way to prove that she was still, she still had it, that
Yep.
she, and then so she hijacked the plane, got off the plane, and I guess while she was on the plane, I don't know the right word to use, but was dressed as a man.
Yes.
Yeah. And so when she got off the plane, she just went back to being a woman and lived out the rest of her life. And that's why she was never found, because they're looking for a man when in actuality, it should be a transgender woman they're looking for. That's what you're saying?
1,000,000%. You got it exactly
Yeah.
correct.
Huh, that is wild. And it would explain why they never, found D.B. Cooper. That's
And
really,
Isaac,
yeah.
is there a more Portland story than D.B. Cooper was a trans woman?
Yeah, that is that is interesting, man. That is very interesting. One thing too I read, it was that the name DB Cooper, he never went by DB Cooper. He just went by Dan Cooper. Where did the B come from?
That's very interesting. So he gives his name as Dan Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
And then immediately after, they look at the flight log. Okay, who did not get off this plane? Dan Cooper. Okay, we're looking for a Dan Cooper. Obviously, it's probably an alias, but you still have to check that off in case he was stupid enough to give his real name. So they had a convicted felon living outside Portland whose name was D.B. Cooper. And you had a reporter talking to a police officer about this case. And he was like, yeah, and we're going to go check. There's this guy, D.B. Cooper. We're going to go check him out real quick and see if it's anything. It was nothing. He had nothing to do with it. It's not him. But it ended up being reported instead of Dan Cooper. He reported it as D.B. Cooper, mixing up the guy he was going to check with the guy that hijacked the airplane. And I don't have direct confirmation about this, but I believe that the FBI liked that the public knew it as D.B. Cooper when in reality it was Dan Cooper, so that if you came into my office to confess and I said, okay, what name did you give when you hijacked the plane? And you say, I gave the name D.B. Cooper. we at the FBI know right away you're not telling the truth and you don't know about this case.
Hmm. That's interesting. That's wild. So this was in the 70s. How old would Dan Cooper be today if he was still alive?
He would be at least 90 years old,
At least a
probably
nine.
closer to 100. And if you think about a 45-year-old man in 1971 that was a heavy smoker that was doing daredevil shit like jumping out of airplanes, I
Hmm.
don't think those guys lived to be 100.
That's
So
true.
Cooper is more than likely dead at this point in time.
Yeah. If is it possible? I'm very likely, honestly, that maybe when Dan jumped off the plane, he died. He didn't survive that jump.
Well, there is equal evidence to support that he survived the jump and that he died in the jump because I have no evidence of either one. I lean way more towards he survived the jump. I would probably say I'm 98% sure he survived the jump. I can't really prove that, but Martin Andrade, again, he wrote this great book, Finding DB Cooper, Chasing the Last Lead, where he really delves into the survivability of that jump. Cooper jumps at night over sort of unknown terrain in what would be a mix of probably 50% wooded area and 50% farmland. Not an ideal jump by any means, but Martin Andrade compares the survivability of ejections in World War II over Europe and found that in those cases where it could be guys jumping from a plane that had its wing blown off and it's spiraling out of control at night in bad weather, um, the survivability of those guys was like 97%. And many of them had one practice jump, and most of them probably only had classroom training on how to
Mm.
use a parachute with a 97% survivability rate. And then to go even further to that, he found that there's a good chance like 2% of those guys were already dead before they hit the ground anyways. So whether or not the parachute worked doesn't really factor into that. And so the point is that parachutes work. And I think that if he pulls his parachute, it opens and then he's injured or gets stuck in a tree, if that's the case, he's found immediately. We find him the second the sun comes up when you have a big like white or pinkish parachute hanging in the trees in battleground, that's obvious it's going to be found. Or even if he's lying in a field next to an open parachute, right away he's found. You also have his copycats to sort of look at how did their jumps go. And they ranged from having some military experience. McCoy was military and did some recreational skydiving. To you had a guy who didn't know how to use a parachute and asked for instructions on how to use one. He survives his jump. You have Martin McNally, who the pilots are like, you know what? This guy, he won't be able to tell the difference between 200 miles an hour and 400 miles an hour at 10,000 feet. So we're going to kill him with speed. So when Martin McNally jumps out, the plane's doing over 300 miles an hour and he's instantly knocked unconscious, but still regains consciousness, pulls the chute, and survives the jump. So in my opinion, there just isn't really, I hate to use the word evidence again, but there's no evidence to suggest that he died in the jump, although I can't produce any evidence that he survived it either, other than the fact that there is no evidence.
What do you find so compelling about this case that you've stuck with it for 6 years?
I mean, it's the vortex. It's once you get sucked in, you can't escape. I've told people it's like, this is the most interesting book I've ever read, but the first three chapters are gone and the last two chapters are gone. And now I'm just so desperate to know the beginning of this story and the end of this story.
Wait, hold on.
And
You say the first two chapters are gone? What do you mean?
like this DB Cooper case, I know the middle of the story. I know the
Oh, I see. Yeah.
hijacking, but I don't know about the planning. I don't know about who Cooper was, Cooper's upbringing, his motivation in doing this. And more than anything in the world, I want to know what happened when his boots hit the ground. Where were you? What was the plan then? Did this whole thing go exactly according to plan? Were you pleasantly surprised? Did Where'd you go? Did you have an accomplice? I'm so desperate for this, and we're so far from it now. It's 53 years since this has happened, and Cooper's most likely dead. If this case is able to get solved in some magical way, I think at this point in time it'll be solved where we'll get to know the name. So we'll find out, oh yeah, it was Tony Clifton. Tony Clifton was DB Cooper, and he lived in Spokane, Washington, but he died in 1994. And there's not much record of him. He didn't tell anyone about this. He didn't write in a journal exactly what happened. So now I know who DB Cooper was, but I don't get to know the details about this. And
Mhm.
I'm not sure, like, do I want it to be solved that way, or would I rather this remain a mystery? Because if it is solved that way, then all these researchers and investigators are then going to pivot to sort of figure out the details of this guy's life. But a lot of that'll probably just be guessing.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It's better, I guess, to just remain a mystery. So let me ask you this. Has anybody ever did any research on how DB could have laundered the money? Because from what I've read, they knew what the serial numbers on the money were. So if he spent the money, that would point the FBI and towards his location. So how could he have laundered the money? Has anybody ever did any research on that? And
Oh yeah, there's been a lot of work done on that. I also had this gentleman Arthur Friedberg on my show, which
Mhm.
if anyone listening is a collector of currency or a historian on currency, they're very familiar with that guy's name. And I asked him about this. Like, you have at least 9,000 $20 bills going into circulation. How is it that none of those bills ever showed up anywhere? And he told me that the idea that you're going to have that many 20s going into circulation and not a single one of them ever came up on a flagged transaction, it just doesn't make sense to him. I even asked him about, like, could this money be spent overseas? Could you go to a casino and exchange the money for chips and then maybe gamble $2,000 or $3,000 and then get your exchange your chips for money, and you're going to most likely get different bills at that point in time. But the problem with that is at the casino with that much money, that's a flagged transaction. They would have looked at least a handful of the serial numbers on those bills. It's true the FBI circulated a list. So this is pre-computers. You're not going to be checking serial numbers on your MacBook at the bank. So they distributed a physical list of 10,000 serial numbers. Now, you're working at a bank, Isaac, and you get some $20 bills in. Are you going to compare every single 20 you get to a list of 10,000 serial numbers? No, that's impossible. You can't do that. But if you're working at a bank, there are a couple things that you will notice. And most of Cooper's bills are 1969 or 1970 Series A bills and a lot of star notes. And that's important because if you're working with money on a regular basis, that's a couple of flags where you will know right away, okay, I'm going to check this one bill because it's a 69 Series A star bill. And I know Cooper got a lot of those. So there was a way for people to look without sort of checking against every single bill. It unfortunately, I started this thinking that Cooper was on a beach drinking a Mai Tai, reading all these DB Cooper books about him having spent and enjoyed this money. But the more I've looked into this case, the more it seems like the money was never spent.
Hmm. And that would go more into your theory about I keep forgetting the name, but the transgender woman, they didn't
Barb
want to spend
Dayton.
Barb Dayton. Let me write that down. So Barb Dayton, they didn't want to spend the money. They just wanted to prove something. Yeah, that's really wild. So I got a couple more questions, and then we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Do you think the mystery would actually ever be solved? I know you kind of touched on this. I know you said you don't want it to be, but do you honestly think at this point in time that it actually would be solved?
Well, I want to clarify. I do want this case solved. I do
Yeah.
want it solved. I don't really want to see it solved in a way where we don't get to understand what happened. But I'm unsure if this will ever be solved. We're at a point now where it's been so long, and we just, I hate to say that we haven't even gotten anywhere because so much work has been done, but I'm not sure how much closer we are to solving this case today than we would have been on November 25th, 1971, which is, it's sad to say. A lot of things have been figured out, but it hasn't really led us to who Cooper was. Not yet, at least.
That's interesting. So in our email exchanges, you mentioned something about the Cooper Convention. What is the Cooper Convention?
The DB Cooper Con, it's awesome. So it's where all of the researchers and fans and people interested in this case get together. If you've ever been part of an online community or had really good friends and you've never met them in person, just that feeling when you all finally get together in one place, it's just amazing. And that's going to be November 15th through the 17th this year at the Seattle Museum of Flight. Your ticket also includes the museum entry, which that museum's funded by Boeing, so it's one of the better aviation museums if that's your thing. But I would encourage everyone to come out, learn about DB Cooper. If you're interested in this case, there's going to be authors that'll be there. I'm going to MC the event. Bill Mitchell will be there, that passenger that I described that was, 20 years old looking over at a beautiful young Tina thinking, why isn't she giving me any attention? He's going to be there. Ryan Burns, Chris Cunningham, a lot of the big names in the DB Cooper case, if you're a fan of this, will be there. And it's just a good time and a good hang.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, it sounds really enjoyable. When is it?
November 15th through the 17th.
November.
dbcooperevents.com. Come see me and hang out.
Gotcha. And where is this located again? The convention?
It'll be at the Seattle Museum of Flight.
Seattle Museum of Flight. Awesome. So, what movies and media and books do you think people should check out? I know you mentioned one earlier, but what are some other media that people should check out if they're interested in DB Cooper?
There's a really interesting short doc. I want to say it's like 3 or 4 small episodes. I think the whole thing's like less than $10 on Amazon. It's called DB Cooper, The Real Story. And just like I've mentioned, there have been many deathbed confessions. And this is a taped confession that you can listen to. And it's Walter Recca confessing to his friend Carl Lauren. And Carl Lauren was forbidden from releasing this confession until after Walt died. So I'm not sure if Walter Recca is DB Cooper, but you can listen to that confession for yourself. DB Cooper, The Real Story, I believe it's called. If you want something real wacky and you are into softcore gay pornography, then I would recommend this movie called Bigfoot versus DB Cooper. It doesn't have much Bigfoot or DB Cooper in it, but there is a lot of super hot shirtless guys working out. The movie doesn't make much sense at all. It's apparently some subgenre of film. But books, there are a couple books I really, really like on this case. We usually refer to this one as the Bible in the DB Cooper case. It's Bruce Smith's DB Cooper and the FBI. It does a really good job going over the case. It goes over a bunch of different suspects. It's very interesting, and Bruce is sort of a mentor of mine. You also have Where Was Skip that came out recently, that goes over Skip Hall or Lawrence Skip Hall. Really good book by my friend John Limbach. I have like 40 books on the case. And it's interesting because there's sort of 3 different events in this case. You have the pre-internet books on DB Cooper, and then you have the sort of internet age of the case. And then you have some recent books that include the ability to take a look at the FBI files. So you have like the pre-internet books, the internet age books, and then you have the post-FBI files release books, where pre-internet, the facts are real loosey-goosey and you can sort of just make up different things because you can't really be proven wrong. Then in the internet age, we sort of clamp down on that a little bit. And then with the files out, we can sort of really say with more confidence what things are facts in this case and what things have sort of been blown out of proportion.
All right, one last question. Are there any other unsolved mysteries that you find interesting? Maybe not as interesting as the Cooper case, but anything else that kind of piques your interest?
I'm very fascinated in Egypt. Who
Mm,
built the pyramids, how they were built, how those stones were moved. I'm very interested in that. I'm also very interested in UFOs. I want to know the truth. I want to see a UFO. I want to see a spaceship. I want to see an alien.
yeah.
But like,
Uh,
I'm not, true crime is not my thing.
yeah.
But somehow I'm in this true crime world.
Yeah. Well, I think this Cooper case, it kind of blends the line between true crime and like uh I don't want to say supernatural, but it's just that mystery. Like UFOs, they have that mystery, there's information that we don't really know. The thing about true crime is that, you don't want to read too many times about a man killing his wife and family and you know what I mean? It's just morbid. So I'm not really that into true crime either. I went through a little period of true crime and I'm just like, there's only so many times you can listen to a man killing his wife and family before it's like, I gotta look into
Yeah.
something else.
When I've listened to some true crime before and it makes me physically angry because I hear a
Mm,
story about a kid being killed or kidnapped or something, like
yeah.
my blood pressure goes up and I'm like, we got to round up a posse and go get this guy. Like,
Yes.
oh, I want to be entertained. I want to laugh. I want to learn something. I don't want to get fired up and get angry.
Exactly. And that's the thing about the Cooper case is that it's kind of victimless. He didn't hurt anybody, he didn't shoot anybody, he didn't kill anybody. He just wanted some money and it looks like he got it.
Yeah, and
So,
even Tina Mucklow, who would be his biggest victim, she said that uh she felt more harassed by people asking her about DB Cooper than she was harassed by DB Cooper.
that's wild. That's really interesting.
Because
All
this has
right,
gone
then.
on for 50 years for her when the hijacking only went on for 5 hours.
Yeah, that's interesting. Only 5 hours, and then we're still talking about it all these years later. So, that being said, before I let you go, is there anything you want to promote?
Listen to my show, The Cooper Vortex, anywhere you get your podcasts, and come see me at DB CooperCon this year, dbcooperevents.com.
Awesome. All right, then I hope people check it out. This was a really good conversation. I learned a lot. You have a nice day, Darren. Take care.
All right, thanks, Isaac.
No problem.
All right, that's a wrap. Thank you for joining us for another enlightening conversation here on Bright Brains. I hope you've gained valuable insights and inspiration to fuel your own bright ideas. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to like and subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform or however else you listen to this podcast. Also, we can be found on all major social media. Just type in Bright Brains with a Z. And remember, the brightest minds are those that never stop seeking knowledge.